And so it'd be crazy for me to give all these lectures. And so for that reason, we have a very fantastic guest speaker coming to speak to us today. And that is, of course, Dr. Jason Riggio. And Dr. Riggio completed his PhD here at UC Davis in ecology. He then went on to work as a postdoctoral scholar, something you do after you complete your PhD, with, believe it or not, the Museum of Fisheries and Wildlife Biology. So that same organization that curates all of those preserved specimens we worked with in lab on Monday is also this massive research cooperative that does really cool conservation and ecology work worldwide. And Jason is a great example of this. For his PhD, he did work on, among other things, habitat connectivity for large herbivores in Africa. For his postdoctoral work, he's done a lot of habitat restoration work, looking at the impacts on conservation action in the Bay Delta region and beyond. And now he splits his time between continuing work on that for the museum, as well as doing work in the Yellowstone area, looking at habitat use by things like pinyon jays, related to our scarabs around here, and bats. So with that, I will be quiet, and I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Riggio.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be up here talking about California's oak woodlands. Normally, the museum curator, Andy Inglis, would be giving this talk, but he's in India today, talking about the international nature of the museum and partnerships we have in universities across the world. So he's out there. I'm stepping in for him. So my name is Jason Riggio, as Rob pointed out, and work in these various places, but California is home, and I've been working for over a decade now in and around the Central Valley, the Pewter Creek watershed, and the California Delta, thinking about questions of restoration and conservation of native species. So this will be a broad look at California oak woodland habitats and just a smattering of some of the tree species that make up those oak woodlands, the wildlife species that are associated with them, and some fun anecdotes along the way. But I'll reiterate, these are Andy's slides, so I'm just stepping in and giving you the words. But feel free to interrupt me at any point with any questions as they come up. Some learning objectives for the lecture. So hopefully by the end you'll be able to describe some key features of different California oak woodlands. So they're not homogeneous, monolithic oak woodland. There are many different types of distinct oak woodland habitats in California. Hopefully you'll be able to identify several vertebrate species that make up those oak woodlands. This is our wildlife talk, but heavily biased towards terrestrial species and species that have backbone. So that's where we're going to keep it to today, and a lot of birds, because that's both what Andy and I tend to focus on in a lot of research. We're bird nerds, through and through. Potentially talk about some threats and conservation issues facing California's oak woodlands, an understanding of how California's oak woodlands sustain biodiversity and how and why they're some of the most biodiverse landscapes in the state. And then have some key terms there. California floristic region, Quercus. What's Quercus? It's the genus of all oak trees, yeah. So that's a good trivia word to know there. Habitat fragmentation, sclerophyll. Acorns, we all know about, endemic, regeneration, human population growth. So some terms and topics we'll touch upon here. So California oak woodlands broadly are plant communities that are found throughout the California floristic province, the California ecoregion. They're dominated by oak trees. They're the dominant tree species across these landscapes. Trees of the species, the genus Quercus, and they're often interspersed with other broadleaf and coniferous trees. So it's not that they form, a single homogeneous landscape of just oaks. There's often a diversity of different tree species, but the community is really focused around oaks as a whole. Oak savannas are a particular type of oak woodland, or more sparse oak woodland, where oaks are more widely spaced, interspersed with grassland habitats. and really are very similar to tropical savanna landscapes where you have single trees dotting a grassland mosaic, and those trees provide a microhabitat across a grassland community. So these oak savanna landscapes. California has, depending on the taxonomist, at least 20 species of native oaks, many of which are endemic to just the California floristic region. These range from a scrub-like, knee-high huckleberry oak that you find in chaparral landscapes, to the valley oak, one of the largest oaks in the world, which can be 7 feet across and up to 100 feet tall. There are also many introduced oaks in the state. As you walk around campus, all the cork oaks you see, those are from the Mediterranean, from Spain and France, Portugal, and they survive really well in an analogous habitat here in California. So a really diverse assortment of trees that range all different shapes and sizes, but are all in that same genus, Quercus. So now I want to walk you through a few of the woodland types, these kind of broad oak communities that make up oak woodlands as a whole. I'll also note, I keep on saying California Floristic Province or ecoregion. It really encompasses the area from like southern Oregon down through northern Baja California, and then all of California in between. So that's all of the ecoregion. So it's not just the kind of those hard artificial boundaries of the state of California, but bleeds a little bit in north and south to neighboring areas. But that single ecoregion, this Mediterranean climate and communities that make up southern Oregon to northern Baja, is hyper diverse and has a lot of endemic species, and these oak woodlands typify a lot of that. So live oak woodlands make up one subset. There are many species of live oak in California. The coast and interior live oaks are the most common ones around here. Canyon live oak is another one that you would see. They're called live oaks because they're evergreen, so they don't drop their leaves. They're not deciduous. They're green year-round, and they form sclerophyllous woodlands, which means hardleaf, a common adaptation in Mediterranean climates because it helps reduce water loss in these really seasonally dry, seasonally arid landscapes, dry summers. And they also allow for the trees to increase carbon gain in regions with poor soil associated with these dry areas. And so the distribution maps on the sides here, the green areas show the kind of broad range of all the live oaks in the California region. Blue oak woodlands are another key oak woodland habitat type in the state. They are winter deciduous, so they drop their leaves in winter. They're really slow-growing trees, and so they don't look like these ancient old-growth forests, but they are. They were never systematically logged across the state. They're not really a valued tree for timber because they don't grow that big and they don't grow that straight, and so they're not easily turned into timber. But tree ring dating has shown that blue oak woodlands make up the largest overall stretch of old-growth woodland in the entire state. So it's not the red fir coniferous forests in Yosemite or the giant sequoia forests that make up the largest area of old-growth habitat. It's these blue oak woodlands, and they're deceptive because they just don't get that big or gnarly, but there are thousands of acres of old-growth blue oak that survive in mixed working landscapes because blue oak woodlands tend to be used as livestock grazing areas, and so they have these park-like open landscapes below them. Oftentimes the shrubs have been removed specifically for livestock grazing, but they provide shade for cattle and other livestock, and so it's these old-growth trees overlying an agricultural landscape. It's really a kind of a unique landscape there, and they're mainly found in this like bathtub ring around the Central Valley. So you have the Central Valley grasslands and floodplains, today almost entirely agricultural lands down at the bottom of the valley floor, and then as you move up in elevation you hit the edge of woodland. That woodland those woodlands are the blue oak woodlands that ring the Central Valley there. And then in slightly wetter and north-facing slopes, you get those live oak woodlands interspersed. A little higher up in elevation, you start entering California black oak forests. And this is also a winter deciduous tree. They grow a little bit larger, both in width and height, than blue oaks. They can actually form pretty massive trees, typically somewhere 30 to 80 feet in height. And they're much more associated with kind of that lower montane zone. So when you drive into, say, Yosemite Valley, you're confronted with a mixed woodland that contains a lot of California black oak. And it's a critical habitat for many wildlife species because black oaks provide a lot of acorn mast for food for species. This forest in particular may be the most vertebrate diverse in all of California because it's in this great elevation, climate transition zone where you get species that are kind of more warmer and arid adaptive from lower elevations, meeting these higher elevation species at this transition zone where the California black oak forests are. So it's a super species rich kind of narrow transition zone there. And California black oaks have also historically been an important timber species, accounting for something like 30% of California's native hardwood harvest. Most of the tree harvest in the state comes from coniferous trees, pines and firs, but of what is deciduous, a lot of it comes from California black oaks. More locally, down on the Central Valley floor and then along riparian corridors into the foothills, we have valley oak savannas. And these are really incredible trees, massive, wide crown trees, up to 100 feet tall, many feet wide in diameter, the oldest specimens. It's a California endemic, so it exists just within the state of California. It doesn't even extend into that southern Oregon, northern Baja range. With a kind of patchy distribution, but locally we can find them on campus, but all along Pewter Creek, along that riparian bottom. It's a really interesting landscape, and the savanna landscape, again, is kind of park-like, where there's open grasslands with single individual massive trees over the top of those grassland areas. But more often, I associate valley oaks with these riparian landscapes down along stream and creek bottoms. And so these landscapes have been heavily converted to agricultural use. So prior to the 1800s, there were hundreds of thousands, 800,000 acres of valley oak riparian woodlands along riparian bottoms in just the Sacramento Valley, so just kind of north of the Delta up towards Redding. Valley oaks were the primary tree of this forest type, these big, massive, giant valley oaks. They produce, in mast years, single trees can produce hundreds of pounds of acorns. They are a really critical wildlife species. And most of these forests have been logged. 99% in some areas of these riparian valley bottom forests had been logged out and converted to agricultural uses. And so there's a handful of places where you can go kind of see this historic landscape. One of them is the Cosumnes River Preserve in Sacramento County, so just south of Sacramento, south of Elk Grove. There's this incredible stand of valley oaks that go along the Cosumnes River, the only undammed river feeding out of the Sierra Nevada into the Central Valley. That's another side note, so it's a really interesting wild landscape. Another patch is at the Caswell Memorial State Park. It's another patch of old growth valley oak, these giant trees down kind of just south of Lodi. So there's a handful of these places that remain, but in most places they're kind of second growth valley oak forests like we have here along Pewter Creek, and they're often a mixed forest between valley oak and Oregon ash, so this kind of combined deciduous landscape. So those are the kind of broadly major oak woodland types: live oak, blue oak woodland, black oak woodland, and valley oak. Questions about those before moving on to what vertebrate species use them. Have any of y'all been down to the Cosumnes River Preserve or Caswell Memorial State Park? Really? Really? Nobody? Highly recommend it. Especially the Cosumnes River Preserve, there's a bunch of great hiking trails in there. Right now, they flood up a lot of the landscape to seasonal wetlands, and they're filled with sandhill cranes and snow geese, and it's an incredible sight. It's really a wildlife spectacle, both from that bird side, crazy diversity, and then these incredible valley oak woodlands. There's a bunch of places where you can put in kayaks if you have access to a kayak, and then kayak through these crazy valley oak forests. Highly recommend it if you have a chance to get out there. And it's like a 45-minute drive. It's not the easiest place to get to from Davis, but still within the sphere of the local area. For the most part, there are some exceptions with some coastal scrub species, some desert species, but for the most part, California's endemic vertebrates are defined by their association with our oak woodlands. So oak woodlands are this really special habitat type that we have in California with lots of endemic ecoregion types, and because of that, there's associated endemic terrestrial vertebrates with them. Some of the statistics here, they include 2,000 plant species, 5,000 insect species, 80 amphibian species and reptiles, 80 herp species, at least 160 bird species. That's really like passerine birds that are using the forest itself, not including waterfowl and different things from those associated riparian wetlands. 80 mammal species. There's a ton of species richness in California oak woodlands. And again, like right here in our backyard, within an hour drive, you can hit basically all of those oak woodland types from the center of the Central Valley here in Davis, and have access to most of these species. But even if you just walk out on campus really, but along Pewter Creek, in the Arboretum, which is partly remnant valley oak riparian woodland forest, you'll have Nuttall's woodpeckers, which are an endemic bird species. Oak titmice, there's a number of species just here on campus that are pretty endemic to just our oak woodlands right here. And the key connection between many wildlife species and oak woodlands is through oak's production of acorns, this incredible food resource that oaks put together every handful of years, just massive amounts of high caloric value seeds that are used by many different species. Our most notable species here on campus, the California scrub jay, and a charismatic bird. So that's one we know fairly well. I assume everybody here has interacted with the scrub jay at one point in time or another. Seen somebody walking up to one with taking a photo of it. I think of a more fun, in some ways more iconic species, the acorn woodpecker. They're a super interesting species. Does everybody here know Woody the Woodpecker? A cartoon character, right? So, do you know what woodpecker his look is modeled after? Not an acorn woodpecker. That's not what Woody the Woodpecker looks like. Anybody know? Yeah, pileated woodpeckers. So they're really big, really incredible. Also, you can find them up Pewter Creek Canyon if you go up towards the dam. So that's what Woody Woodpecker looks like. But his voice was modeled after an acorn woodpecker. They make really weird, kind of cackling, clown-like calls. They're super social, really gregarious. They exhibit some sexual dimorphism, so males and females have slightly different head patterns. And they live in these family groups. They up to 10 birds, which is known as a collective, which includes 2 males for every female, so they're polyandrous. All of the members in a collective help raise young together. They all collectively forage, and they primarily subsist on acorns, which they gather up every masting season, and they plug into dead trees into these incredible granaries. Each one of these is a little acorn plugged into a hole that they drill themselves. And they can do this for thousands of pounds of acorns a season. And so unlike scrub jays, which fly around collecting all those acorns and then they cache them in the ground, they dig them into the ground, and they'll plant 2,000 acorns a season, but they'll remember like half of them. And so lots of acorns grow and oak trees grow because of scrub jays. Acorn woodpeckers, they're seed predators. None of those seeds will ever make it to being grown. So different ecological relationship with oak trees. But another fun side note of acorn woodpeckers is those collectives where their territories meet, they'll war. So they'll get together and they'll battle each other. Individual on individual will be fighting over those territory areas. And other collectives will fly in from neighboring areas and sit on the branches and watch the warring individuals fight it out like it's the Colosseum or something, and then somebody figures something out and the territories get settled and then the farther ones fly away. So it's such a strange social thing, and that's the only example I know of like other species watching the battles of other groups, except for maybe humans, because we're weird like that too. And to give a sense of what an acorn woodpecker can do in terms of seed collection, see all the holes on the side there. There's where the acorn woodpeckers have drilled acorns into this microwave antenna.
Go ahead.
The power of the oak woodland and the acorn woodpeckers that utilize it. It's pretty amazing. Another really fairly strictly oak woodland associated endemic species in the California ecoregion is the oak titmouse, closely related to the juniper titmouse of the Great Basin and the tufted titmouse of the East. In fact, they were all used to be lumped in one superspecies, the plain titmouse. But the oak titmouse is what we have here in California, found throughout the variety of different types of oak woodlands. They are a secondary cavity nesting species, which means they nest in holes that are created by other species like pileated woodpeckers or Nuttall's woodpeckers. So they come in, they drill holes, or maybe a branch falls off and a hole is created, and that's where oak titmice will nest. So they're not only reliant upon oak woodlands for the food resources, but also for nesting habitat in oak trees. And they have long kind of pairs form bonds for many years, defend year-round territories. They're super territorial birds. They're very noisy and gregarious, so if you're in an area where there's oak titmice, you hear them before you see them. And they have tons of personality, super charismatic. They're closely related to chickadees. And in winter, when you find flocks of oak titmice, you often find chickadees associated with them. So you get these mixed species flocks all foraging together in winter, and then breeding season rolls around, mated pairs separate out. They fight over different cavities to nest in, and go through the annual reproductive cycle. And a reminder that again, the word endemic means it is only found in this area. So it is a relatively small region that contains the entire distribution of a species. So a species is endemic to just this very specific area. So something that's pretty special and localized. Something you may notice again, you'll see that that same general distribution pattern for lots of these species. That southern Oregon to northern Baja, kind of around the Central Valley. Which is really the range of oak woodlands. So if we're talking about the range of oak titmice or these oak species, the endemic oak species, or Nuttall's woodpeckers, that's the range that you get. Another famed member of the oak woodland community is the California quail. They're a really interesting, again, very social, gregarious bird species. Their young are precocial. Have you ever heard the term precocious? Meaning, really quick to gather information, really quick to intelligence, really quick to growing up fast. And in terms of precocial birds, they're species whose young have their eyes open immediately upon hatching, can immediately get up and run around, because California quail are kind of like, running around Thanksgiving dinners for food out in these oak woodlands. They're a prey resource for many predatory species, and so their young have to be up and moving immediately from the moment of hatching. And they form these large coveys, mixed groups of males, females, juveniles all together, these large extended family groups. And within those large social structures, they make a number of different calls, some of which are really like the iconic sound of chaparral and oak woodlands, and many movies that are filmed in and around LA, when they have like any natural setting out, you'll hear a California quail in the background. That's considered their assembly call. There'll be like one individual perched up somewhere high, telling the whole covey to gather around, pulling in all the individuals that went out a bit far. People say it sounds like Chicago, Chicago, or I love you, I love you. But a really iconic California quail sound. So whenever you hear that out in the world now, you'll know California quail. An even more range restricted endemic, really a very, very small range species, is yellow-billed magpie. So distinguished from the more wider ranging western U.S. species, the black-billed magpie, by its really bright yellow bill. It is the mascot of the Museum of Wildlife and Fish Biology. It is a really incredible bird. It's almost tropical in looking. It has this like iridescent blue-green sheen, blue-green-purple sheen on the wings, this bright yellow bill. They're big. They're a corvid, so they're, again, social, super intelligent. Corvids are the crows, ravens, jays, magpies, nutcrackers. And it's another endemic species of oak woodlands and savannas here in California. Yellow-billed magpies are a really colonial and social bird. They've adapted to the agricultural landscape, so they do fairly well in the face of the Central Valley's habitat conversion, being able to forage in and among human landscapes. They have tons of different vocalizations, and a lot of them are very like parrot-like, these kind of loud, raucous calls. So you hear them before you see them. If you bike out anywhere like west of campus along Russell, like out beyond Trader Joe's, they're often in the trees that line that bike path that go all the way out Russell. However, they're super susceptible to West Nile virus, which is problematic for all of the corvids, but particularly yellow-billed magpies. And so the graph here shows from 2000 to 2019 the number of West Nile virus cases. This is human cases, so the number of West Nile virus cases in humans in the Central Valley over time, and the number of yellow-billed magpies on associated Christmas bird counts, so the number of individuals counted during birds. And so when West Nile cases were really high, no magpies. As West Nile cases kind of went down, magpie populations rebounded a little bit, but they're still, overall, yellow-billed magpie numbers are at 20, 30-year kind of lows. They've stabilized a bit as West Nile virus numbers have stabilized a bit, partly because of tons of vector control effort, but they're really, really susceptible to the virus, and their fate is kind of tied to how humans are managing that in mosquito populations now. Similar things have happened to crows. So on campus we have like roosts of tens of thousands of crows that come in at night, and you can see them all streaming in. That roost was down to hundreds of individuals 10 years back, 15 years back, and has rebounded. And the crows seem to have adapted, population level. They don't get impacted by West Nile virus as much anymore, but magpies still seem to be really harmed by the disease. Another oak woodland adapted species, another one that's really important for the museum's work, is western bluebird. So it's one of the 3 species of bluebirds in North America. So western bluebirds, eastern bluebirds, and the state bird of Idaho, and the state bird of Nevada, I think. What's the third one? Anybody know? Mountain bluebird. So the mountain bluebirds are in California as well. But down here locally we have western bluebirds. They also are secondary cavity nesting songbirds, so they require holes that are produced by other species or from branches falling off to nest. But they do really well in nest boxes. And so the museum has the Pewter Creek Nest Box Highway, so 200 nest boxes strung up at 8 different sites, or it might be more sites now, from essentially the Monticello Dam all the way down to the Yolo Bypass. And it's really helped to locally recover the population of western bluebirds because in the Central Valley, with 90 plus something % of those riparian woodlands lost, that was a ton of nesting habitat for the secondary cavity nesting songbirds that was destroyed. And even as some of the habitat regenerated, those oaks were fairly young, they hadn't been hit by disease, and holes hadn't been put in them by woodpeckers, and they hadn't grown big enough to have tree branches fall off and create holes. And so nest boxes provide an analog to those cavities, those natural cavities, and they're really quickly filled up by bluebirds, tree swallows, house wrens, ash-throated flycatchers. And so of the 200-something, 200 to 300 boxes that are out on the creek with the museum's Nest Box Highway, 90+% of them are filled up producing young every single year. So thousands of chicks every single year, which is really incredible success. And their populations had declined partly because of that, the habitat loss component, but also because European starlings, an introduced species, they're bigger and social and much more aggressive than some of our native secondary cavity nesting songbirds, but also rely on cavities for nesting. And so in places where there were still some cavities that were available, if it was big enough for a starling would always outcompete the native species for that hole, often killing the adult birds. But the nest box that are placed out on nest box highways all throughout the country are designed so the holes are just barely small enough that a bluebird can make its way in, but a starling can't. So it helps the recovery of the species from that additional threat. And if you're interested in being involved in that project, they're currently enlisting interns and nest box coordinators for students who check all those nest boxes and ban the birds and check the progress of all those nests every year at all of the sites. So check, if you're interested, check on the museum's website. I think the application period is ending fairly soon. So you can also tell Rob, who will tell me if you want to get involved in any way. But I know there's lots and lots and lots of applicants this year, so something of note, a way to get involved in these oak woodland habitats. That's it for birds. Before I move on to mammals, any bird questions? Just throwing species at you right now. All right, mammals. Brush mice are one of the species in the broad deer mice group, Peromyscus. Deer mice, or Peromyscus species, generally are notorious as being the vectors of hantavirus. Not so much for brush mice, but for the species generally. But brush mice are thought to be the most arboreal of the mice in oak woodlands, so they spend a lot of time in the canopies of oak trees rather than skidding around on the ground, more like the standard deer mice. Acorns, like for many species, form a really important part of their diet, and in turn, brush mice form a really important diet of many predatory birds and mammals across oak woodlands. They're really tied to these landscapes, so young brush mice seek out places like the ones in which they were raised. And interestingly, they sing. So they perch up on high perches in oak woodland canopies, and they call these ultra high frequency territorial songs. Because it is ultrasonic, so that's adapted to our hearing. But they imagine little mice perched up in trees just screaming into the night. The Merriam's chipmunk is an endemic chipmunk species of California's oak woodlands. So chipmunk's a perennial favorite. I'm sorry we don't have them on campus here, because that would be a great addition to the fox squirrels. They have stripe patterns on their tails that are unique to each chipmunk species, and so that's how you tell a Merriam's chipmunk from other chipmunk species in the state. And they have these incredible cheek pouches that they just stuff full of acorns as they run around the understory, and then they bring them back up to their caches that they have in trees, also using secondary cavity nesting places like many of the bird species in oak woodlands. Now, for a species that I'm only moderately convinced exists, because I don't know anybody's ever seen one. Have you ever seen one, Rob? You've seen a ringtail? Okay. All right. I accept it then. Apparently, though, they're everywhere in oak woodlands, and I've spent a lot of time in oak woodlands. I guess I'm not around at night, but I've never even seen one like dead on a road. But this is a relative to the raccoon, more similarly associated with species of Central and South America, so it's just the northerly most member of its group. But ringtails are these raccoon relatives that are highly arboreal. They're pretty strictly nocturnal. They live throughout oak woodlands in California, really large ears, big eyes for nocturnal living. They hunt rodents and small birds, so they are predatory. They have these really long tails that provide balance for their arboreal life. And they have ankles that can rotate 180 degrees, so they're really adept at climbing up and down, kind of face down trees and climb back up. So they're highly adapted to the oak woodland arboreal life. Striped racers are an endemic snake species to California's oak woodlands. They look very similar to the common garter snakes, which is something you'll stumble across much more often if you're out wandering around, even in oak woodlands. The key thing to note is that if you see a kind of a dark gray, black, and yellow striped snake, if it has a dorsal stripe, so a stripe along the middle of the back and the top of the snake, that's a garter snake. No stripe on the back, that's a striped racer. Striped racers also tend to be really thin and long, and they move fast. They're really, really quick species. They can climb, so again, living in the oak woodlands, they're partly arboreal. They move with their head off the ground, so they can view above the grasses underneath oaks. They specialize in catching small lizards, but consume other snakes, including rattlesnakes. They'll eat birds and small mammals. And they're primarily a diurnal species. They use sight for hunting, so they're out during the daytime. So it's one of the snake species that you're more likely to encounter in some of the oak woodland landscapes, particularly as you get up into the coast range. So if you ever end up on a field trip to the UC Reserve Quail Ridge, they have striped racers up there. I've seen them a few times up in that landscape. Oh, and there's also a Bay Area endemic subspecies of the striped racer, the Alameda racer. So another thing to look out for if you're a Bay Area native. Arboreal salamanders are a unique and again endemic salamander species. You can also find them up at Quail Ridge, up and around the field station during kind of spring. You'll see them. It is a lungless salamander, so this is a species that respires completely through its skin, so it requires moisture year-round to survive because it requires a wet skin barrier to breathe. It is adapted to climbing up and down trees, so it has long toes and a rounded tail. They've been found up to 59 feet above ground in trees. I'm sure they're higher than that, but it's hard to do surveys for salamanders at the tops of 100-foot tall trees. And despite the fact that it requires water year-round to breathe, a wet skin, wet substrate, it's a fully terrestrial species, so it doesn't return to water at any point during its adult life. It doesn't, unlike a newt, which has to return to water to breed, it nests up in trees, in tree hollows. So you could also probably call this a secondary cavity nesting salamander species, but a unique species to California. And they're these pretty little dark-colored salamanders with light flecking on them. Another kind of interesting herp species that's endemic to the California region is California legless lizard. So they, kind of this very slender tube-like shape. Head and tail is very similar, which may be an adaptation to prevent predations. They move their tail like they'd be moving their head, and so a predator may go for the tail instead of the head of the animal. They burrow in sandy substrates, so they're really hard to find out on landscapes. You have to be in very particular habitats, and usually underneath logs and in sandy substrates. They're often confused for snakes because they have no legs or just like little vestigial stumps, but they have eyelids. So here's a legless lizard blinking, and so if you're lucky enough to be hands and knees down rummaging through the leaf litter and sand and find one, note that it is indeed a lizard that you're looking at, not a snake. Oak woodlands have also been, I guess, while we're still on the terrestrial wildlife side of things, any questions now? Yeah?
What's the benefit in them having eyelids to just like snakes having no eyes?
That's a really good question. I suspect it's not necessarily a benefit or a negative, but it's just an evolutionary holdout that there was no selective pressure against eyelids, and so there was selective pressure against limbs in a burrowing species, and so members of this species that were better able to move through sandy substrates without limbs holding them back, they survived better, but eyelids probably had no effect on one way or the other. That's a really good question. It's often tough, for things that don't have a clear adaptation where there's like clear selective forces on it. They don't disappear then, but they may not be providing a benefit. Yeah, but maybe something about burrowing means that eyelids are really good. I don't know. Yeah.
How close is this to like because it looks physically like a snake, but it's called a legless lizard.
Mm-hmm.
Slightly a little bit deeper. Is it in the middle of both of them, like family-wise?
Nope. So it's fully split, like fully on the lizard side, and post, went from a legged, it's evolved from legged lizards. So it's two separate evolutionary trees that have ended up with this slender legless form for moving underneath substrate. So kind of convergent evolution of two different groups that ended up with the same shape and structure. Yeah. And so you also find like there are other species along that chain of adaptation. So you get legless lizards that have like just the two hind legs, like two very small hind legs and no forelegs, that look somewhere in between, but they all came from the fully four-legged tetrapod lizard species. Yeah.
Why do they evolve like this? To make them move faster?
Presumably, there's some advantage to being really streamlined when burrowing and moving throughout sandy substrates that not having limbs confers some advantage there. Although, not entirely sure, but clearly, something about that shape, that form, that works really well for some of those species. Yeah.
Do they also have the capability to climb?
That's a good question. I've never heard of them being, moving up into canopies, but I don't know, even into like, small shrubby landscapes. I have no idea. That's a really good question. Yeah. Cool. All right. I want to touch briefly upon not just the importance of California oak woodlands to the plant side and the animal side, but also to people. Right? This is the landscape that fed cultures for thousands of years. California indigenous people have been linked to oak woodlands for millennia. Again, the resources provided by oak woodlands, like acorns, really provided a bounty of ecological goods and services for humans. Acorns remain a staple food amongst California native peoples, and oftentimes, the large communities were based in oak woodlands around grinding stone rocks that were used communally to break down acorns into flour. So there's Indian Grinding Stone Rock State Park, State Historical Reserve, east of Sacramento, highlights one of these historic places where there's this massive flat rock landscape and all of these grinding holes born out of it from thousands of years of people producing flour from acorns in this landscape. So it's really an amazing historical site. Again, another place, if you got a chance to explore around a bit, highly recommend going out there. And so, the flow of life was often centered around masting seasons and acorn production, and food production generated around acorns. People have not only relied on oak woodlands for a very long time, but more recently done a very good job of cutting down those oak woodlands, much to the ecosystem's kind of demise. More than a third of all the oak woodlands have been estimated to have been cut down and lost since the settlement of California by Europeans. So of an estimated 10 to 12 million acres of oak woodlands in California, we're down below 7 million acres. In agricultural landscapes, it was kind of widely perceived that oak trees on grassland landscapes were a waste of grassland habitat. And so where you couldn't easily cut down one, you would blow them up. So that's what that photo showed here. So the original UC Cooperative Extension Land Grant University that we're at here would promote blowing up oak trees to get them out of grasslands, to have more grassland acre for cattle to graze on. Large areas of oak woodlands were cleared across the Coast Range. And you can see this kind of in a lot of the satellite image of the Coast Range. You can see kind of continuous oak woodlands and then patches of very clear, hard boundary grasslands. And oftentimes the woodlands don't come back because the grasslands preclude the growth of new oak trees coming up. They overtop any seedlings. So once lost, they're pretty hard to recover without a lot of really active restoration. And that's made doubly hard because most of the oak woodland habitat in the state is privately owned, 4/5 of oak woodlands. So unlike the higher elevation coniferous forests that are mostly held in national forest lands, lots of state park lands, up higher elevations, Yosemite National Park, Sequoia National Park, the oak woodlands are lower, and they have been privately held for hundreds of years. And the land values, woodland was very low. You're not growing any cows or agriculture on it, but today, vineyards are really valuable in oak woodlands, historic oak woodlands in Napa and Sonoma counties. And so even today, we're removing lots and lots and lots of oak woodlands in those landscapes to produce grapes for wine. So conservation threats continue today. And I will leave that there. Thank you all for listening.